What's the most inappropriate thing you've witnessed at a funeral? Story 1. My father's funeral, after the service and the reception after. My mother, brother, and sister headed back to our family home. A bunch of my father's siblings and their family were also staying at the house with us. We got home a few minutes before everyone else. I was sitting at a table in the living room when I could see their cars come down the driveway. They all got out and were hugging and seemingly congratulating each other. The reception after the service was beautifully put together and was actually a fun time. A fitting send-off for my father. So I assumed they were still just having fun from that. Until they came inside, they all came in together very quickly and quietly. They came up to me and my older brother sitting at the table and kind of crowded around like a bunch of kids, about to see if they could have a cookie before dinner. My Aunt Barbara smugly stood at the front and asked, "So when are we going to be doing the reading of the will to see what was left to us all?" My brother and I just looked at each other for a few moments before we turned to them to say, "Are you kidding? Reading of the will? Like a soap opera? There is no reading of the will. Everything that belonged to my father now just belongs to my mother." The look of defeat but not shame was disgustingly transparent. They were supposed to stay another few nights. They packed up and left that afternoon. Story 2. My own kids. Boys ages 10 and 8. At their great-grandfather's wake, they got a chair and moved it to the casket and started making his mouth into smiley face, laughing the whole time. When me and their grandfather, my father-in-law, saw it, I immediately pulled them away and told them they shouldn't do that. Grandpa laughed and said it's fine, he would have really loved that they did that. We later found out that the great-grandfather had asked the funeral home ahead of time to put a sign in his hand that said thanks for coming, but they refused. Story 3. An estranged uncle driving past my grandmother's funeral. Playing another one bites the dust. It's no longer a sore point for me or my family. That uncle was suffering from a mental breakdown due to drug abuse and a high-pressure job, and that combination eventually took its toll. It makes it easier to deal with than if he was just being a spiteful prick as we thought at the time. Story 4. At my grandma's funeral, there was a woman that had a really bad relationship with my grandma, but one of my aunts invited her to the funeral. She started receiving people as if she was a family member and tried to put herself at the center of everything. Story 5. Not a funeral, but my grandmother was on her deathbed. She was going in and out of consciousness. My bad father and his bad sister start arguing over who will get her wedding ring. Not for sentimental value, but because they wanted to sell it. Anyway, to make a long story short, they took the ring off. And their mother came out of consciousness, and the first thing she said was, "Where is my ring? F scumbags." Story 6. At an open casket wake, a friend of the deceased attempted to give her a drink of single malt whiskey. She ended up being forcibly removed as she wouldn't stop, and spilled a lot of the alcohol in the casket. It was as horrible and inappropriate as it was heartbreaking for everyone. Story 7. A relative of my husband died. There was a gathering at her house after the funeral hosted by her husband. It was mostly family of my husband, but there were a few friends. There was catered food and drink, and people were just general socializing and telling nice stories about the deceased. About 2 hours in, a man and woman in their mid-20s show up. They are acquaintances of the widower. They walk around the house a bit, grab a drink, and then disappear. I was asked to get some more drinks from the garage, which was off the kitchen. I opened the door and stepped into the garage. There was the young couple leaning against a car and engaging in some pretty vigorous relations. Another family member who was standing in the kitchen saw what I saw. I backed out of the garage because I was fairly embarrassed. I mean, who does that at a funeral? I guess the other relative told the widower, because the next thing I know, there is shouting from the garage, and the widower is telling these two people in no uncertain terms that they needed to leave. Apparently, not only were they having S in the garage, but they were doing lines of coke off the hood of the car. Only a few people who were at the gathering found out what happened, thank goodness. Story 8. Not super inappropriate, but my grandfather was always a trickster. He had a great sense of humor. He had this little song he would sing to me, my siblings, and my little cousins where he would just repeat the words poo-poopy-doo over and over. At his funeral, my aunt was telling stories about him, and in the middle of her telling a story, my 6-year-old cousin screamed poo-poopy-doo in front of 50 people. Needless to say, it lightened the mood a little bit, and made everyone a little happier remembering him in a good way. Story 9. My brother-in-law's girlfriend locked herself in a car, cried and screamed, threatening to kill herself at my father-in-law's funeral. She was fined 5 minutes later and explained to my in-law she did it because she's not used to not having all the attention. She thought her being pregnant would make people forget that the father died. Story 10. My cousin's funeral. He was 27 years old and killed in a single car crash after he hit a slippery patch on the road and smashed into a concrete wall. At his funeral, all of his brothers, sisters, and parents sat on the front row at his graveside service. Then, lo and behold, my cousin's ex-girlfriend of over a year shows up and immediately inserts herself onto the front row next to his sisters and proceeds to scream, cry, scream, wail, and throw herself on the ground periodically throughout the service. All of the family just gave her awkward stares, with no one wanted to address her inappropriate behavior. I had never seen that type of attention demanding drama queen antics before. Story 11. My sister's elderly Phil found out he had cancer and shot himself in the head. He wasn't one bit religious, but her husband, his son, had joined the Mormon church and decided on his own that the funeral services should be held there. The Mormon minister, who had never met the deceased, proceeded to hold everyone but me and my spouse captive for well over an hour, while he described in minute detail why we should all join his church and become Mormons. We got up and walked out on the sales page after 20 minutes. Story 12. Picture, if you will, to elderly women in a funeral squaring up as people are still crying from the ceremony. At the lunch after my grandpa's funeral, his daughter from a previous marriage, Dee, who no one had seen in years, showed up. Dee had been writing bad checks all the way to the state prison, and had definitely had some unresolved beef with my family when she got out. The last time my mom saw her was when was 11, and Dee left her infant daughter for my mom to babysit and never came back. Fast forward to the funeral. Dee is acting like it's a family reunion, but no one is having it since she's basically screwed everyone in the room in one way or another. My grandpa's last girlfriend, a legally blind woman, tried to physically fight her until others stepped in. Story 13. Was at the funeral of a priest once. He was so well liked in the church. Not only were there dozens of other priests, but something like 2 or 3 bishops. More than half of the people had to stand outside of the church and listen via loudspeaker. Kind of hard when the neighbor of the cemetery plays anti-church and anti-God songs loud enough to hear nothing else. I'm absolutely not religious, and usually listen to exactly the same music as well, but holy cow, that was inappropriate. Especially because the guy got up at around 8 a.m. on a Sunday, just so he could F with people. Story 14. At my great-grandmother's funeral, her son showed up to the funeral wearing khakis and his bright orange Tennessee Vols shirt. Then he started yelling at my mom when she asked him who the pallbearers were going to be, mainly throwing a fit about who was in the will. Mind you, we hadn't even left the funeral home yet, and were literally needing to know who they would be at that very moment. Needless to say, we don't talk to that side of the family anymore. Story 15. Maybe isn't as over the top as most of these comments, but I'm one of the Marines that has to go present the flag to the next of kin. When a service member dies, it's usually old Vietnam and Korea vets, but sometimes it's a Desert Storm or recent war vet, and the mother is there receiving the flag instead of a son or daughter. Point is, I've probably been to 45 funerals in the past year. It's striking how often someone's phone goes off during the service. It seems nearly every other or every third service, someone's ringtones start playing. There's been a few times where someone will get up from their seat and answer the phone too. Story 16. I know a little boy who said his first word during the moment of silence at a funeral. Time to drop a toe and clearly say shit. In context, right? Ripples of laughter went through the hall. Like 200 people were at this funeral. Not a single person scowled or told me off. And one older lady came up to me and said you can be assured she would have laughed the loudest. She probably still is. That was quite the chuckle we all got. Special thanks to my oilfield husband and my father for their chronic use of said word that led to this moment with my eldest lone fruit. Story 17. When my dad's mom passed away, there were a lot of people there. He comes from a family of 10 as his sister passed away a while ago. So there were a lot of nieces, nephews, and cousins. It was an open casket. I was around 12 to 13. But everyone was grabbing things from her, off her from the casket. All the aunts grabbing things for their kids who don't even know her. Remember who she is, way too young. The only thing my dad has a keepsake of his mother is a little rose pin that she wore in the home she was in before she passed. It's unfortunate and makes me feel very sad for my dad. Story 18. My grandmother's funeral was on her birthday. I purchased happy birthday balloons because it was what she would have wanted. I was immediately reprimanded by my mother when I arrived as she forgot it was her birthday. But everyone that knew the family knew that she would have loved it. Even my grandfather laughed when I walked in with them. Story 19. I went to my uncle's funeral with my dad, sister, and friends. My father was already hammered, and my idiot friends dressed in t-shirts and shorts. To top it off, my cousin wore the skimpiest top to her own dad's funeral. My father, wasted, was hitting on his own sister-in-law. My cousin ended up inviting us to smoke medical marijuana in her car. It was a disaster. Story 20. A narcissistic family member arrived late, after everyone else was at the graveside for the burial, and probably lurking behind a tomb to pick the perfect time. After the priest had just started talking, wearing an enormous hat and sunglasses and low-cut gown like she was attending the Golden Globes, red carpet or something, and loudly making an absolute scene of how devastated she was, darlings, and just generally making it all about her.